Tonight we have a rather extensive theological topic. I mean, potentially. This is something that, as of late, I could talk about a lot just because I'm interested in it lately. But we will go ahead and hit the transition button and then get started. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Alrighty. Get ready for Theology Corner, folks. All right. So, what are we talking about this evening?
So I think we're gonna go straight for the end.
Straight for the
Eschatology.
end. That's right. We're going to talk about the lovely word eschatology tonight, also known as end times theology. And so it's going to be, I think, a mixture of things we're going to do here. So we're going to tell probably our stories as to like how we were first introduced to the topic of end times theology and our sort of journey into where we presently are. I don't think we're exactly in the same place now. Um, Not necessarily
Not
because I think we're going to like viciously disagree, but more that like
yeah.
uh, I've dedicated a little more time as of late to it, uh, whereas you've sort of escaped one perspective but have not landed necessarily. And so this is potentially going to be fun in that I might frame this as sort of Eric Red Pills Caleb on his perspective, assuming I'm convincing enough if I end up making some arguments. But go ahead and tell me sort of your experience with the topic, how you experienced it, what you were taught, where you leaned, and what uh, turned you off to certain things, turned you on to certain things, if anything. So go ahead.
Yeah. So I, I guess like many people, I grew up in a um kind of default pre-trib dispensationalist type background. And I say like most people because I think that was very really prevalent there for a while and may still be. Um, you know the I'll backtrack before the Left Behind books came out. The church that I grew up in, charismatic church, very much into end times study. At times, maybe obsessed about it a bit. Um, I don't want to come off like crazy critical in that. That's not my heart in it. I'm not trying to be like negative towards the church that I grew up in or anything in regard to that. But that was a hallmark of the church that I was part of was a lot of discussion on end times things, and most of it was trying to kind of figure out what's going to happen and you know kind of giving warnings as to why if you're not ready, like a thief in the night, um, Jesus was going to come and I would be left behind. And ironically, from that one sentence comes two um, not so great movie series. And book one was a book series. So there was this movie series that my church watched really early on called Thief in the Night. And I mean, it just was almost like paralyzing, fear inducing. Um, because I at that age couldn't really reckon with the theology of it and understanding like I guess under that, would I be one of those who would be beheaded and hunted down and all this kind of stuff? I just really couldn't reckon with the theology of it, didn't know what it really meant. And it just caused a lot of fear. Essentially, my assumption was I would be left behind, and my assumption was I would be hunted down and executed. So
Mm-hmm.
that was just kind of where I defaulted. Um, Around the time the Left Behind series came out, there was a lot of guesswork as to who might the Antichrist be. I think in most of those circles, it was, you know, pretty much believed by most that the Antichrist was at least alive. And so get ready because any moment, you know, go practice your rapture drills, jump up in the air a few times. I say that as a joke. Um, the Lord was going to come back and we would need to be ready. And there was a lot of sincerity in that movement. The people were very sincere in what they believed and um but a lot of fear as well, and that's not a good way to lead. And then fast forward a few years, I went to Bible college, and um, I would say they were far more dispensationalist in their understanding of things, or their framework for things. And I took study in Daniel, study in Revelation, and just some Pentecostal distinctives. They were more Pentecostal in tradition rather than charismatic, but um, again, lots of end times things. Believing in pre-trib rapture and those things, and I think for me, I got to a place where I was pretty exhausted by it all.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, it was almost like a daily conversation, at least to some degree. And I wasn't exposed to a lot of what else was out there other than the typical, like, you don't want to fall prey to these other thoughts on it. I had never even heard of um I guess I'd kind of heard of post millennial, but not a definition of it, just a phrase. I'd never heard of a millennial, however you want to say that. I'd never heard of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in my childhood, or much into later years beyond even Bible college. That was never explained.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I got exhausted by it because I found what would happen is you would have a lot of people who were gazing at the future of what may occur, coming up with some pretty substantial hypotheses,
Hypotheses?
hypotheses,
I think
and
that's it.
not very much focused on proclaiming the gospel and understanding faith and grace and the scriptures, unless it was trying to figure out what the scriptures were saying about the future. And I just got tired of that, because one parallel that really kind of sealed the deal for me is, as I see in scripture this constant thread of Israel missing the Messiah, my thought was, what if, by being so obsessed with what might happen in the future, we miss his second coming? Now, I have reckoned with that a little bit better, but that was legitimately my thought. Like, Israel missed it the first time. Are we going to miss it the second time because we're so obsessed with what it has to look like?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've heard people say, like, the Antichrist has to be American. The Antichrist can't be American. The Antichrist has to be Roman. No, the Antichrist has to be a Muslim. So it's like all these different threads of what it has to look like. And my thought was, we're going to miss it.
Oh, this is gonna be fun. There's there's I've got so many hot takes based on it's fun. No.
Well, good,
All
good.
right. Anyways, go ahead.
So, yeah, if I was to describe myself right now, I made a joke in the text thread, and I don't know if it even makes any sense. I chuckled when I said it, so it made.
Oh, you're freezing up. Hold it. Go ahead.
Um,
Say it again if you already said it.
yep, sorry. So I made a joke in the text thread. I made a joke in the text thread of, and I don't. Nobody else might like this. Maybe nobody thinks I'm funny. That's fine. Um, I used to be pre-trib and dispensationalist, and now I'm a registered independent.
There you go. All right.
Tudum-tsh.
Boom. Okay. Yeah. Do you want me to take over? I mean, if you have any other thoughts, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll frame it this way.
Yeah.
If there's a red pill to be swallowed, um,
Yeah.
I think I've kind of defaulted by my surroundings of Reformed theology into maybe a Diet Cola version of amillennialism.
Mm-hmm.
But even in our conversations, there's been some things where I'm like, yeah, maybe I don't fully even know amillennialism that well. So,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
you
Our
know,
former pastor, I used to say, like, he would say, "Oh yeah, I'm Amil." I think, or he would say he leaned that way, but then I'd hear him interpret some passages, like the ones we are, like the one we're going to talk about tonight. Spoiler. And I'd go, he'd interpret it, and I go, "No, you're still pre-mill. At least you have you have dispensational remnants in your bloodstream." Is sort of people don't realize how pervasive those interpretations are. But anyways, so what I'm thinking we'll do here, I'll give a little bit of my story here. Then I'll kind of label myself, and then we're going to look at a passage sort of as a case study of how vastly different these views are. I think I'm going to define, I think, the categories of the schools of thought. I already have a video doing this in a really succinct, in the most succinct way I could. It's earlier on in my channel, if you want to watch it. But I'll be doing something similar. But I'll try to explain the views as we go, as I talk about my journey. But then we'll do a little bit of case study with a passage, and then I'm going to show you sort of the apologetics relevance of this issue with a clip where Doug Wilson was debating Christopher Hitchens. It looks like we have some chat stuff going on. Yeah, Ash said, just say you're pan mill. Ah, yes, that's the old joke. I'm a pan millennial. It'll all pan out in the end. Which,
Oh. I was about to respond to it. I haven't heard pan mill.
yeah.
That might be a better joke than my registered independent.
Right. Yeah. I'm kind of, honestly, I'm kind of sick of the expression, mostly because, well, here's the sad thing. You talked about your story and how exhausting this can be.
Yeah.
Which is sad to me in that I've seen that. I've seen the exhausting nature of people, putting up charts in their Sunday school classrooms or in their basements if they're real obsessed. Yeah, everyone's, Christian uncle wants to write a book on eschatology because he figured something out, or, and you don't know what to believe because there's quibbling, uh, among about some nuances of it, and people have burned out on that to the point that today that's not the trend I see. The trend today is how you feel. It's like this is only going to be divisive. It's like there's no, but that's gotten so bad that we don't treat the topic like it's tackled in the canon, and so we stop talking about it. And so,
Yeah.
like, when's the last time we've heard very, very many sermon series in our circles on the full book of Revelation? I heard one series where they talked about the letters at the beginning because they're very practical.
Yeah.
We can apply them to our churches, but like the actual prophecies that follow that, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And so that's sad because I think we should preach the whole Bible in principle.
Yeah.
I mean, if you preach long series and you're in the church for years, there's things you may never get to just because of time. But I don't think we should be in a place where we don't get to something because we can't figure it out what we would say.
Yeah.
I feel like
No, I
that's
agree with that. And I've been hesitant in that sense. So one of my roles with the church that we're part of, um, I'm one of the elders there. I'm kind of the primary preaching elder, and um, what goes with that is that I along with feedback from others, but I primarily set the tone of where we're going, and I've got a list of things that I want to preach on, series that I want to go through, and Revelation actually is on there. I think you and I talked about this several weeks ago.
yep.
It's on there, but it's one of those things where I realized like I really need to have this a little bit more settled before I go there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of why it's been part of our conversations, but as well,
Yeah.
um, got me interested in doing some additional studying
Yeah.
before we attempt to tackle it as a series.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so my story was similar to yours. Like, I was raised early on Pentecostal. I remember I'm trying to think if it was during the same period, but there was a period where my parents said, if you read the whole Bible in a year, we'll give you $100. Now my brother did it. I didn't realize that I had a children's Bible that was actually the New Testament. And I read the New Testament in a year. And so that happened, but I'm not sure that was the same phase when I read Revelation, like that I remember reading Revelation. But what I remember when I did read it, it scared me to death. I didn't know what this was about. I just see monsters and angels and bowls and seals and all these things and tribulations. And I asked my mom about it, and I'm trying to remember the order of things. But I asked her about it, and she tried to explain it, and I think I was already crying when I asked her about it. I was like, "What is this?" And then my dad got home. She's like, "Maybe Dad will explain it to you." And he explained the pre-trib take. He's like, "You don't worry about it. You're gonna miss it." Right. So,
Don't worry, you're gonna be left behind.
um, okay. Oh, got somebody watching over on Discord. Well, welcome. All right. Anyway, so that was my first experience. I didn't think about it a lot that I remember after that. I think Left Behind came around a little while after that. Are you still there? It looks like you're frozen ish. Well, you're sort of moving. Oh, okay. We're okay. Um, you were holding very still, I
I,
guess.
I froze for a second.
Yeah.
I froze for a second, and then I was reading something.
Yeah. So, yes, that was my first exposure. And I think, yeah, shortly after that, Left Behind came out. I did end up reading the children's edition of the Left Behind books. You remember those little children's Left Behind books? You could
Yeah,
read.
I've read a few.
Yeah, you could read them. You could read them like in a sitting if you read fast. Um, I didn't remember a whole lot of those, but yeah, it was the typical, And I remember when Left Behind came out as a movie with Kirk Cameron, and we all went around handing out like free tickets to the movie for people around the neighborhood to go and see uh, the things to come, and so that was my only exposure. And then I think I heard some like quibbles here and there about the timing of the rapture, pre, mid, or post trib. But yeah, that was basically all I knew about for a long time until I went to. Well, I told you last week I went to Elam Bible Institute, and I think by that point I had heard there were different perspectives on something, but it was all within the premillennial framework, basically. And in my New Testament class, they staged a debate on pre, mid, or post trib rapture. And I remember in the midst of that, I think I watched it. It was interesting. The guys who argued for mid tribulation rapture actually worked the hardest on preparing their debate points, and actually made the most convincing case in that context, which was interesting. But then I went back into the pews, we were in the chapel. It wasn't pews really, but it was chairs. I went back in the chairs to my friend who was sitting in the class, and I said, "What's your perspective on it?" And I'm not sure I'm remembering correctly, but I think he said, "Well, I'm a millennial, so none of this applies to me." And I went, "Huh," and that was all I heard. Then, for some reason, these things were eventually tackled in a class. They got, I think, into all the perspectives: preterism, futurism, that spectrum, pre, mid, post trib, dispensationalism, historic, premillennialism, amillennialism, postmillennialism. I think there was a class where they talked about all of them, but I didn't retain any of it, like at all. And I don't know why. Maybe I did, and I've forgotten. I've like blocked it out. But basically, I started reading around and hearing some things in class. By the time I transferred to NIAC, I kind of identified myself as amillennial. After reading some things, but even that, I think at that point I was more in the school of kind of where our former pastor described himself, amil, sort of by proximity. But I didn't know all of the ways that premillennialism or dispensationalism sort of creeps into all of your biblical interpretation. And so then I got into Sam Storms and began to more fully understand amillennialism, and I'd say really settled there for a while. But then after that, I started watching some of Doug Wilson's content, and I read, what was the name of his book? Heaven Misplaced. It's a very distilled argument for postmillennialism, and it was really convincing. And so, but the thing is, like, I feel like it sounds like I'm jumping perspective to perspective. I think a lot of the presuppositions that shifted for me and coming into amillennialism, they don't all go away if you become drawn to postmillennialism. There's a lot of biblical interpretations that amillennialists and postmillennialists share. And so it wasn't as big of a leap, but there were just some passages and interpretations that began to make more sense. And so it really is sort of a progressive journey for a lot of people from dispensationalism all the way to postmill. And those are generally the order in which they shift, because you're letting go of more and more and more presuppositions you used to have. And so that's my best explanation. So how we want to do this? I should now, I suppose, give oh, Ash, I'm tired of people attacking John MacArthur for his eschatology views. Yeah, I mean, I disagree with them for sure. I think he would call himself either a dispensationalist or a progressive dispensationalist. So he's very premillennial.
Mm.
He recently, this will become clearer what he meant by this as we explain the views, but he said, "Oh, you post millennialists thought you were going to walk into the kingdom. We lose down here," is what he said. Um, and so, like, yeah, I disagree with that, as I'll explain. And so, some people probably attack him pretty harshly or whatever, but some are just disagreeing with him, and I think it's warranted because I disagree with him. But we'll describe the views here. So, um, let's see how fast I can do this. The best way that I think I have to explain it. Let me see here. All right. Yeah. So yeah, I'll definitely get back to the comments shortly, but I need to do my best here to explain this. So generally speaking, the debate centers around what the millennium is. There is at the end of Revelation what is described as this 1,000-year reign of Christ. And the debate titles, you'll notice I'll have the word millennium in them. They all relate to what you believe that millennium is and where we are in relationship to the millennium. And where Christ's return is in relationship to the millennium. And then all of those perspectives fall on a spectrum that would fall between what is called futurism and preterism. Okay, so I should actually start by describing futurism and preterism. Basically, futurism means that you take the Bible and, for the most part, you see New Testament prophecy as having yet to be fulfilled. So you see things as future, as primarily future. Preterism means past. I don't remember which language or whatever, but basically, for the most part, if you're a preterist or a partial preterist, we'll talk about extreme heretical preterism later, but if you're a partial or orthodox preterist, you see the majority of New Testament prophecy as having already been fulfilled. And so and that goes all the way up to postmillennialism, which sees all of the Bible as having been written before 70 AD. Generally, I think there's some variation among postmillennialists, but they see all of the Bible being written pre 70 AD, and for the most part being fulfilled by events in 70 AD. Minus like the climax of Revelation and the physical return of Christ, they still see as future. But for the most part, a postmillennialist, an Orthodox preterist, postmillennialist, will see pretty much the entirety, minus the end, of the book of Revelation as having already happened. And an amillennialist tends to see it's more split. Like, as Sam Storms sees the dating of the book of Revelation as being around 90 AD. That's actually the more popular scholarly position these days. And so he sees the book of Revelation much more as I'm trying to remember his full interpretation, but he definitely sees much more of it as being reference to the future, or a lot of it as being like I don't know if this is Sam Storm's view, but I think he probably does see at least a lot more of the book of Revelation as being principles of the way that Christ has victory over the world and experiences Christians will have, rather than having a very specific historical fulfillment. Although he does see, I think, some of it as future as well, though, more of it anyways. Whereas the premillennial view is much more futurist in its interpretation. And this is what we're all used to. Don't A-mills think Ash is saying, don't A-mills think the same as post-mills? Kind of. She says, oh, I guess not, but I'll explain. So basically, really you could actually split all these perspectives into two in the sense of post-millennial, premillennial, because the premillennialist sees Christ coming back next, setting up an earthly reign, and that reign will be 1,000 earthly years of Christ reigning as king before the eternal state comes about. Okay, so the millennium is future to the premillennialist. right? And it comes after the physical return of Christ. The amillennialist and the postmillennialist see, in some sense, that the millennium is present. It is now, in a sense. Sam Storms would explain it as the millennium is the reign of the saints with Christ in heaven.
Mm.
Um, and it's present. It happens during the church age. Whereas the postmillennialist sees Christ reigning from heaven, yes, and it's present, but it has far more earthly impact. And they would see, for instance, 1 Corinthians 15, it's in 1 Corinthians 15, it says, I can't remember the exact verse, but it says, he must reign until he puts all of his enemies under his feet. And it is talking about a present reign of Christ. And so this is what's going to happen during the reign of Christ. Okay. Is anything fuzzy so far, what I've said? Does it make sense so far?
Yeah, I'm tracking with it.
Okay.
Um,
Easily
I
gets fuzzy here, but
yeah, I mean, I see glimpses of things that I agree with in the sense of, like, um, well, I mean, I think your explanation of what pre-mill is exactly right, and
mm-hmm.
I assume your explanation of post-mill and a-mill is
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
As far as my concurrence with such things or agreement with such things, um, I haven't necessarily seen anything yet that I disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
In
and
terms
so
of which,
maybe
perspectives?
yeah, I guess that's where I'm saying where I would say maybe it's still a little muddy for me. Not that your
mm-hmm.
explanation was bad, but I'm going okay. So in some sense, I'm a little bit a-mill. In another sense, I guess I can echo some of the thoughts of the post-mill
Mm-hmm.
because I haven't necessarily seen the distinctions quite clear yet. But that
Mm-hmm.
might be more on my end.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. So, having said all that, no, I should distinguish between dispensationalism and historic premill, but all premillennial perspectives see that millennial reign of Christ as future. The distinction between historic premill and dispensationalism tends to be like a John Piper would be a historic premillennialist. He's not a dispensationalist. Um, he sees the millennial reign of Christ as future, but what's distinct to dispensationalism is a much more sophisticated theological system of interpreting prophecy in the Old Testament. They get a lot of their theological points from a specific interpretation of, I believe it's Daniel 9. So in Daniel 9, that's where they draw things like a 7-year tribulation.
Yeah.
Yes. Whereas and if I haven't hinted at it yet, I think, well, I have stated my position basically. I've basically become post-mill, but the amillennial and post-millennial tend to agree, I believe, that they basically see, and I think a lot of the time historic pre-mill would believe that uh, Daniel 9 specifically, and most of those like Old Testament texts that people see as referring to our future actually were fulfilled in the coming of Christ. Okay. And then like this tribulation and things happened around 70 AD. Okay. And so all of this talk of this tribulation, the specific number of years tribulation, and the rapture somewhere in there, that's coming from this uh, certain interpretation of the Old Testament that ultimately, from what I understand, particularly dispensationalism, not necessarily historic premill, but dispensationalism came around much more around I think the 1800s. Whereas historic premill you see as far back as I think Augustine. I'm trying to remember if Augustine himself was premill or if it was more you can see it. I can't remember where he stood on it personally, but yes. Let me take a quick look here. Not so sure about that, Ash. That's interesting. Okay.
I looked at that comment as well, and I do vaguely recall some teaching regarding that, and there being some sort of um,
Symbolic.
symbolic sacrificial system
I don't know.
reinstituted in the
Yeah.
heavenly temple.
Yeah. Oh boy. Dispensationalism has so much variety. What's so sad to me is that I very much disagree with dispensationalism at this point. We could get into different reasons. But like it has gotten so varied and convoluted in all the debates that take place in it that the exhaustion of that makes people afraid to settle on what I see as very sound perspectives. Like I see postmillennialism as a very sound perspective, but people see it as one of so many confusing perspectives.
Hmm.
But I think that's primarily because of dispensationalism, that we feel as hopeless as we do.
Yeah, I
In
would
turn,
agree.
yeah. Um, so, anyways, that's my take, anyways. But all right, have I explained enough that I think we could do a case study and show how this works?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So here we are. Uh, yeah, I think we could start right at the beginning here. All right. Would you like to read some? We could take turns a little bit, but I think I'll pause and ask some questions about interpretation as we go, basically.
Okay.
But this is basically one of the major tests of what you think prophecy means. And as we read this, I guarantee you're going to have presuppositions about a lot of these words mean. And I'm going to try to give you sort of like, I'm going to label those interpretations according to the systems they come from. And then I'm not sure I've settled every interpretive question, but I basically think I know where I sit. But you're basically going to see there's very futurist interpretations of this passage, and there's very preterist interpretations of this passage. And you'll see what we
Okay.
mean here. I'm going to be using ESV Ash. Yes. Which is, yeah, as far as the debates go, I don't tend to see too many say that translation affects interpretation of this passage, but if there's little issues like that, I can mention it. But, okay, so go ahead if you want to read some.
Okay. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you that truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when we will see these things, or when." I'm sorry, I'm struggling.
Yeah.
"Tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And
Mm-hmm.
Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray.
Okay,
For
I'm gonna
many
have you
will come."
pause. I'm gonna have you pause at verse 4. There, it ends. Or no, where did end of verse 3? It says, "And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, there's parallels of this passage in Mark, Luke, and this passage. One of the debates here, one of the parts of this debate center around what are the disciples asking one or two questions. Notice they said here, and I should jump over to Mark 13, but I don't. This is going to get convoluted if I jump around too much. But let me just see really quick here on my phone. Mark 13 is the parallel. Okay. Okay. So notice the way Mark words this. Tell us, when will these things be? This is Mark 13:4. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Okay. Now, from the sound of that in Mark, is he asking one question or two questions?
Hmm.
It seems it's more debatable if you
Yeah.
read Matthew that there's two questions.
Yeah.
To me, it seems clear in Mark there's one question.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm tracking. Tracking.
All right. So generally, the debate splits here. People say, are the things Jesus is talking about here, are these things that have already happened, or are these things that have yet to happen? And most will say some of this has been fulfilled. But if you're futurist, you're going to say a whole lot of this has yet to happen.
Right.
But if they're asking one question, then the answer to all of them is going to be the same. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a futurist, they tend to split it up more. He says, well, he's saying some of this is going to be fulfilled and some of this has already been fulfilled. And they split it up to really push a lot of this forward. Okay. In my understanding, this is one question and they're just restating it in multiple ways. Okay. So continue on with verse 4.
And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets.
Ah, got a frozen. Sorry, go back like one verse.
Sorry.
You froze up a little.
Verse 11, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come.
Okay. Now, continue. Verse 15. Now, okay, well, I'm trying to think if I should comment before you go to verse 15. So, intuitively, up to verse, if you could split it up or decide what parts of this do you think are yet to come and what have happened already?
Well, I think this is actually some of where I've already began to shift my perspective or my interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, Ash. I think it was, what did I say? Mark 13. I said a verse. Yeah, Mark 13:4. Ash was where I paralleled. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I've come to see most of this as past tense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there's a couple ways to say it correctly. It's future tense when Jesus is speaking.
Yep.
But from my perspective, these
Mm-hmm.
are events that have been fulfilled.
Okay. And so, interesting. So you do know a little bit more than many who are sort of in flux would probably know about where the debate sort of lies here. But you'll notice how I'll sort of, we can walk through it and I'll sort of say what a dispensationalist would probably say. What I know they would say, having just listened to a lot of a debate about this recently, says many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed through the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, has that happened already? How could we say that's happened already?
Will.
But you don't have to answer now.
Okay.
But you can see now
Yeah.
where the debate begins to diverge. Because clearly we've always been taught.
Yeah.
All nations means everyone's got to be evangelized, then Jesus comes back. Right? And we have a very specific meaning of what Jesus coming back means in this context. Now, we should say right up front, all of the perspectives believe Jesus is physically coming back in the future. What they differ on is which passages are talking about that. Right. So go ahead with verse 15.
So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who... What's that?
It's very specific.
Yeah. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen, or such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out.
Where are you?
Verse 26.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
It's
a little cut off there. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather.
I guess you could continue.
Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
Now, how on earth could we say that that's already happened? That is the question.
Yeah.
Right. Now this is where Sam Storms would begin to, an amillennialist would diverge from a postmillennialist. Because
Okay.
even an amillennialist at this point will begin to say, there's two questions being answered here.
Okay.
So a Sam Storms would take Mark and he'd say, well, we can't. This is why I have a problem with Sam Storms' interpretation here, is that I think a gospel account should basically stand on its own to whatever the original churches that had it. They wouldn't have necessarily had all the gospels. But according to Sam Storm's perspective, you can't understand that Mark is two questions unless you have Matthew.
Hmm.
See my point?
Yeah.
And so he would say there's two questions. First, Jesus answers, what will be the signs of these things happening, talking about the destruction of the temple, and what will be the sign of your coming. Right. And so he says those are two questions. First, he answers the destruction of the temple, and then he answers when he's coming back. One of them already happened, one of them hasn't happened.
Hmm.
Whereas to me, it seems very clear in Mark, he's answering the same question. This is all one question, which means it all has to be future or it all has to be past. Or Jesus was wrong. So this is where we'll get into the debate in a little bit. But I think there's a little more. Yep. Okay. 32.
From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away.
Now there's a fascinating little. This is where I listened to a debate between Gary DeMar and and where is my brain? What's his name? Michael Brown. And Michael Brown is a dispensationalist. Well, he's a premillennialist. I don't know if he'd call himself a dispensationalist fully. He believes in like a post-tribulation rapture. Gary DeMar is a postmillennialist, and they walk through here, and most of their debate was them quibbling about whether this generation means this generation. And that is, you can see why that would be the key to most of this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away. My words will not pass away. And then, okay. So Sam Storms now would then break this up again, though. Because what does it say next? But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two men will be in a field, one will be taken and the other and one left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day the Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Okay. Do we want to stop there? Let me see. Okay. He sort of illustrates the point, but it's the same point again, I think, so we don't have to read it. Okay. So I think Sam Storms would kind of point out Jesus gave a whole bunch of markers as to how you would see these things coming. And then he would say, yeah, but why does he say we don't know the day or the hour? And so he's saying we know more about the coming of the destruction of the temple, but we don't know the return of the return of the Son. That's how he would split that up and explain that. But again, I would point back to Mark and say, I do think he's answering the same question here. The coming of Christ in this specific sense and the destruction of Jerusalem are still the same event. He's giving markers, but not the exact time. And that's what he means. So we know, but we don't know, basically. If
Okay.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think I walked through the two interpretations well enough there, right?
Yeah, I think so.
But now we need to get a little bit specific, at least on a few points. Because some people are going to say, what, how can X, Y, or Z be future? But, okay, the best way to do this, though, would be, I think, Dragon Fist, Harold Camping was a quack. I agree. Okay. Okay. But, so I think what we could do, though, is like people might be wondering now why this is relevant in some ways. Some of it's pretty obvious, I think. But I want to show you why, apologetically speaking, this is relevant. Okay? We're going to watch a clip. This is a debate from, it was in the middle of a documentary about Doug Wilson and Christopher Hitchens. Basically, Christopher Hitchens is the late new atheist who he would go around and he was usually associated with guys like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, one of the new atheists, right? And he actually ended up going on a sort of a book tour with Doug Wilson, who's a post-millennialist. And they wrote a book that was a compilation of a blog debate that they did, basically. And they went on a tour, and throughout the tour, they would debate each other. And at one point, they stopped, I believe it was at Westminster Seminary. And this is a clip from that debate. And so I'm going to play it for a second. I'm going to pause it, and then I'll make a comment, and then we'll finish it. Are we ready?
Ready.
All right.
A resuscitation. Lazarus died again. Jesus was raised from the dead, never to die again. The resuscitations that Jesus accomplished and that Peter did and happened in the Old Testament, resuscitations occurred, yes. But Jesus was the first person in history to come back from the dead, never to die again.
And to say he would reappear in the lifetime of his disciples.
Okay, so that's where I wanted to pause it. See the relevance now.
Yeah.
Hitchens sees, because it looks like Jesus is saying that he's going to return in this generation. Dispensationalists take it as literal physical return, but they redefine this generation. But Hitchens sees through that as, no, he meant this generation. And according to the dispensationalist definition of return, it didn't happen. So it's a false prophecy. Okay, so there's the apologetic relevance.
No.
Yes.
No, he said he was going to come back and destroy Jerusalem, which he did in 70 AD. Right on the money.
It was the Roman Empire didn't do this.
No, he said this generation will not pass away till all these things are fulfilled.
Oh.
The sun, the moon. Hang on a second. This is really important, actually.
I know it is, yeah.
Yeah. When Jesus says in Matthew 24, the sun's going to go out and the stars fall from the heavens, he's quoting from Isaiah 13 and Isaiah 34. There's decreation language throughout the Old Testament. Every time it occurs in the Old Testament, it always refers to a military destruction of a nation or a city-state. Always. In Isaiah 13, an oracle...
See that moment there with Hitchens? He's like, yeah, Hitchens has read the Bible, surprisingly. He knows, he's like, oh yeah, that's what the prophets say.
against the king of Babylon. And then you have the same decreation language. Then Jesus says in Matthew 24, not one stone's going to be left on another. The disciples say, when it's going to happen? Jesus quotes Isaiah. So Jesus is not talking about the end of the space-time universe. He simply isn't. Has nothing whatever to do with that. It has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened within one generation, just as Jesus said, authenticating him as a prophet.
Don't you have an abnormally unsuspicious mind? If you see someone saying, I'm saying this so the prophecies can be fulfilled, he knows what the prophecies are. And he says, the prophecies say, if the Redeemer comes to Jerusalem, he'll come riding a donkey. Where's my donkey? Let me straddle the donkey and come in, and it's Passover time.
Sure.
And it says in the books themselves, it says, and this was done so that the prophecies might be fulfilled. So it's a self-conscious engineering
I'll give you
of what would be laughable to call predictive.
I'll give you the donkey. The donkey could have been arranged. What I was talking about.
Donkeys can always be arranged.
I was talking about
Asses can be arranged.
I was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which was not arranged that way. So when Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem, my central point is you interpreted him as predicting the end of the space-time continuum. He wasn't talking about that at all. He was predicting the end of the Judaic Aeon, the temple sacrifices, and Jerusalem, and he did not arrange for the Romans to come in and do that.
There you go. Are we tracking a little bit here?
I think so.
Yes. Okay. So we can see, in my view, if you come to a more preterist, post-millennial perspective on this passage, it's a powerful argument that validates the prophetic authority of Christ. But that it's difficult though, because we've been very, it's been ingrained in us what it means for Jesus to quote unquote return in every context that language is used.
Yeah.
And we're only covering one passage here. If you buy the arguments in this passage, it still raises a bunch of questions about a bunch of other passages. Like like you have to ask how to interpret Revelation. You have to ask. There's a passage in 2 Thessalonians that's difficult. I think it all tracks. I've chased those down, different commentaries and things. I think you can line it up if you understand the vocabulary, but it does take a serious reframing of vocabulary. And so let's go through this one more time and see what some of these words might mean. But we don't have to read all of it. But one guy I'd recommend from the post-millennial perspective is Kenneth Gentry. He's done more commentary work and things on this. But he does a lot of work talking about the historical context, what was going on around Rome leading up to 70 AD, and how well it lines up with language in Revelation, and how well it lines up with passages like this. Okay. So then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Now there's two things here. It says all nations. People often say like, oh, well, this has to be universal, and the gospel hasn't gone out to all nations yet. Generally speaking, I think, particularly in this passage, I think there's good arguments, and we'll get to it with a certain word that's used eventually. I think that the world, all nations, is more of an idea of the Roman known world and the nations governed by Rome. And there's a word that lines up more with that's coming up when it says world. The Greek word behind it is not cosmos. Okay. It's another word. I can't remember the pronunciation, but it can be much more specific to the governing regions of Rome. And that is what it means in Luke, for instance. And the fact that he's talking to this specific audience before the gospel's even gone out yet, I think is a hint that it is limited in its meaning to that. All right. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. Now, this already happened in 1 John, didn't it? Mm-hmm. Here's a fun factoid. I don't know if we'll get to it unless I mention it now. A lot of people think that the term Antichrist is in the book of Revelation. It is not. It is in 1 John, and it's likely, according to Doug Wilson and a lot of commentators, they believe that it's referencing a false teacher named Cerinthus, who, in the definition biblically, is someone who denies that Jesus has come in the flesh. Whereas the beast in Revelation is what they confuse it with. The beast, according to preterist scholars like Gentry, they believe, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that the beast is actually Nero. Okay, so again, these are very contemporary events. Ash is saying this is starting to make more and more sense. Okay, good. I hope I'm being clear here. And again, feel free to jump in if I'm unclear or something, or you think I don't agree with that because X, Y, and Z. That makes it more fun. But but yeah, this is more me monologuing here because I'm trying to red pill Caleb. But we'll see. But it sounds like he already has heard some of this, so I'm not treading too much new ground for him. And many false prophets will rise. Yep. So, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Now, there it is. Again, the whole world there is not in the Greek cosmos. It's the known Roman world governed by Rome. And the reason I say that is because if you look, for instance, in I think like Romans 16, Paul says this gospel has been proclaimed to all nations.
Yeah.
In the past tense. But we know that it hadn't happened in the universal sense we would think of.
Right.
It had only gone out in his missionary journeys around Rome. Right? So that does line. So actually, you can actually look at the book of Acts as a fulfillment of a lot of these things. So like Luke, you could see Acts as part 2 to Luke. Luke talks about this. It's parallel to this passage. Okay. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed through the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. The end of what? It doesn't say the end of the world. In the post-millennial perspective, it's the end of the Judaic Aeon, is what they called it. The end of the sacrificial system, the end of sacrifices, the end of the temple, the end of the old Israelite worship system. And that's what the book of Hebrews is all about. Okay, so number 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now again, look how specific and local this is. It's a specific era when these locations were known in this way, these mountains, and it's not only an instruction to that generation, it's the people in front of Jesus. And it is known that once 70 AD came about in history and the Romans came to destroy Jerusalem, a bunch of Christians escaped. And probably because of this prophecy. Let the one who is on the housetop, we don't go on housetops anymore, again, not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, okay. Okay. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Look at how specific to Jewish Christians this would be. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Now, there's a couple explanations as to that, because a lot of people say, well, the Holocaust was worse than that, right? One, it could be a figure of speech, because in the Old Testament, you see, for instance, Solomon is referred to like as the greatest king that ever was or ever would be, but a future king after that is referred to the same way. And so it could just be a more of a generic term for greatness that's hyperbolic. Or it is literal in the sense that it's not worse in the sense of the number who died, but it's worse in that it literally ended Judaism in its present form at the time. So in either way, okay. Either one of those work for me as an explanation. Where were we? Such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. For the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray. Now, I can't remember personally, this is where I'm still sharpening some of my knowledge on this. This is where I think Gentry would be helpful. He points out some historical fulfillments of this that could line up with this as to what was going on in that time. Because a lot of the time we're looking forward to, well, there's going to be false Christ. There's going to be these false miracles. Those haven't happened yet. But I think there are some historical examples of things that were going on that do line up with that. But again, my historical knowledge is still patchy there. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. All right, let's go down to, okay. Now this is where Doug Wilson jumped in and talked about this. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. This actually parallels, I guess, the very vocabulary you see, I believe, in prophecies in Isaiah, I think 13 was one of them. I think there was one later, like Isaiah 34 or something like that. But it prophesies judgment, I believe, on Babylon. And it uses this language. But the fulfillment is a military strike.
Okay.
But it uses this cosmic language of stars falling, things like that. So dispensationalists will go outside, they'll see stars in the sky. Well, they're still there. It hasn't happened yet. But if you understand Jesus as echoing prophetic language of cosmic shaking of the universe, but what it's really talking about is a military destruction under the providence of God of a nation, then there's nothing extreme here at all, actually. Let me see if we got... All right. All right. I'll get to some of those comments shortly. All right. Are we tracking? Have I put anybody to sleep yet? It's like, what?
Okay, wake up. No, I think I'm tracking.
Okay. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Now, often dispensationalists will respond to a post-millennial take of this and say, well, what was the sign of the Son of Man? And they assume it's like, well, I see literally Jesus standing in the distance or something. Like, I imagine that's what they imagine. And I'll be honest, I don't know what the sign of the Son of Man is necessarily. I guess there are historical, like, apparently there's some claims that went around at the time that people saw angels in the mountains during the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't know if that's true. Could be what this is referring to. I don't know. For me, it's not so much whether there's a point for point fulfillment that we can look back to in history. Is like, for me, there's a whole bunch of parallels that are obvious, and then there's some details that we're not certain of, but it would have been clear to those who experienced it. And maybe we can track them all down if I did a little more work, but well, no. Okay, coming in the clouds of heaven with great with power and great glory. Let's see. Dragonfist says, great just to hear fellow believers talking about the scriptures. All right. And Ash says, this is really helpful. I'm really grateful you guys are doing this. Great. All right. Yeah. Well, we're coming down to it here. Yep. The sign of the Son of Man. Okay. And then here was a little point that got pretty interesting in the debate between Brown and DeMar when I was listening today. I guess here it says, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Now, what confuses people, and this is what also confuses a lot of people in the book of Revelation, we see the word earth, and it feels like a very global event.
Yeah.
But I guess a valid translation of earth can also be land. And so it says all the tribes of the land would mean all the tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
Right? And so that, again, very plausible reading that makes it much more local. Let's see here. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of the Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and then he will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, this is where it gets a little interesting. Again, we assume, because of our dispensational background, that the idea of gathering from the four winds, it must be like the rapture, right? Take out all your dispensationalist presuppositions and ask, what does it mean to gather from the four winds? It's an odd phrase, however you slice it, and we don't know what it means on the surface, but we assume it's something dispensationalist. There's a couple things I want to point out here, though. Let's see here. We'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. From what I understand, that parallels a passage in Daniel. Again, we see dispensationalists talk a lot about Daniel, but I think there's a prophecy in Daniel that we do know that everyone agrees was fulfilled, where it was a judgment on a nation. But it talks about the Son of Man coming in glory, but it is talking about a heavenly reality, not necessarily a physical coming. And it's a heavenly reality that is reflected again in the judgment of a nation, I believe. And so there is a heavenly meaning of that could be there. to the Son of Man coming that is not a reference to his physical second coming. So I'll mention that. Again, I'm not saying this as articulately as like a scholar would who is literally writing the commentary on it, explaining the exact wording, but this is what I took from what I've heard and read so far. And then it says, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, something Damar pointed out to Michael Brown. Michael Brown was like, look, this is so obviously the rapture. This is so obviously the second coming. Damar pointed out, it doesn't say from the four corners of the earth, which is used in other passages. It says the four winds, which is, I think this might be the only place that term is used. And it says from one end of heaven to the other. Damar theorized that maybe this could be, I have my own possible interpretation that I had before I heard him say this that I'll mention. But his theory was maybe this is referencing those who had died in the old covenant, but who believed.
Okay.
Maybe, which was interesting because it's talking about gathering from the four winds in heaven. Maybe it's a spiritual kind of description of the gathering of the souls who had died before Christ. There's no evidence in the text to prove that, other than that it's an odd turn of phrase that isn't even used when we would like four corners of the earth or something like that. So maybe. My take was, and I think this is reflected in 2 Thessalonians, if you take the preterist view of 2 Thessalonians, in there it says, and then we will be gathered together. And again, we usually take it as rapture, but it's a word that is used in Hebrews when it says, don't neglect the gathering of yourselves together. And so I would take this as a parallel, I think, to some other passages that talk about the gathering of the whole church. In other words, once the Judaic aeon is over, there is one body in Christ. And the elect are gathered into one body after the Judaic aeon is over. So again, that sounds crazy because we assume this heavenly rapturous language, but we load that so much with our dispensationalist tradition that we don't think, well, wait a minute, start from scratch. What, in context, what does this mean? And don't forget, he said this would happen in that generation. And so that would make sense if he's talking about the gathering of the entire church after 70 AD and the uniting of the body of Christ, Jew and Gentile, the gathering of the elect from the four winds. And that in that context, you could parallel it with the four corners of the earth, or the whole known, Roman Empire, in the nations coming to Christ, gathering together. So that's sort of a mixture of my take presently and what I'm starting to hear some other perspectives, but I think there's some very plausible explanations as to how that could be something other than the rapture. Right?
Yeah.
And then from the fig tree, learn this lesson, as soon as its branch becomes tender, puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Well, there you go. And again, like people might say the heaven and earth will pass away at this event. I think he's just saying, he's talking about the reliability of his words at that point, and not the passing away of the earth when these things take place. But that's at least my present take on it. And that's sort of hopefully helped give, oh, wait a second. I lost the chat box. You probably have the chat box better than I do. I don't know if there are any more. But there is a... Oh, there we go. Let's see here. Isn't it believed that the beast in Revelation is believed to be John's personification of Nero? Yes, so I did mention that before. That is the preterist take on Revelation. And Ash said, I've never heard that before. Yeah, well, I probably said a lot of things that people who have been drenched in modern eschatology haven't heard before, so I'm not sure specifically what she's referencing. But yeah, I want to say that I read that somewhere, but it's just a theory, not really provable by the text itself. Now, Dragonfist, if you're talking about Nero not being provable, I would say it actually is quite provable in that the numbers 666 line up in the Hebrew number system, which was aligned up with their letter system. if you take their number/letter system with 666, it spells out Nero. And not only that, but I guess there was an alternate manuscript that said 616. And a lot of people didn't know why. But some people have theorized that an early scholar took this view of it being Nero, but they wanted to communicate the message of Revelation to a more Greek audience. And in the more Greek alphabet, 616 creates Nero.
Interesting.
And it actually does if you do the if you use that letter numbering system. So there is some internal evidence in Revelation that's pretty remarkable in terms of the book of Revelation specifically referencing pre-70 AD leading up to 70 AD events. Yes. Then Dragon Fist, I want to say that I read that somewhere. Okay. This is really helpful, and I'm grateful you guys are doing this. Okay. Oh, okay. We already saw some of that. Great. All right. So any thoughts, any pushback, any... I've been released from the Matrix feelings now. I don't know.
I think I'm more solidly dispensationalist now.
What have I done? That's ridiculous. No.
Blasphemy.
Blasphemy!
Yes, there it is.
No, yeah, I mean, some of it I've heard, not all of it. I will say that much. Definitely want to dig into it more to understand. I feel like there was a lot of good stuff there, a lot of things to help me process some of these things. You know, I'm familiar enough with, I guess, some of the way that Jesus speaks and echoes sentiments from the old covenant, you know, specifically Isaiah and other places, to understand that the way that language works is so, I think, so vastly different than so much is assumed in just the casual reading of scriptures and just the casual church goers experience. You know, like even the idea of idiom is kind of lost on us. You know, you were talking about a turn of phrase and even the four winds and things like that. Like there are certain idioms that were used in scripture that are lost to us. And so if you don't do the digging into these things and you just kind of take the, I don't know, the typical line that's handed to you, there is the chance that, you know, something like that is lost on you and you don't see it, or maybe even the preacher who is sharing these things with you doesn't see it or understand it. So
yeah, and it's not even just that we're ignorant of those historical idioms. It's that we now have this established dispensationalist theology that has loaded the vocabulary for us before we even approach the text afresh.
Right. Yeah. And I do think that I think that is most commonly the thing, because one of the things that as I was listening to it, you know, there's a lot of that, even though I've moved away from the premillennial, the dispensational background, there's still a lot of that language still in my brain rattling around. So yeah, I my default, ironically, is to even side towards the thing that I actually know I disagree with now.
Yeah.
You know, it's just so inundated there.
Yeah. So that last statement there. So what are you saying? Are you?
I guess what I'm just saying is like those are the words that are rattling around in my head.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it's like I gotta purposely work through them.
Yeah.
Like even though I've moved away from that dispensationalist background,
You're
and
still,
I would say I don't agree with it. It's like those are still the words that are rattling around in there, and that I have to work through as I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. And some of that was, some of those final those final statements. It's like, you know, it's a reflex at this point.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. It's a reflex.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there was another.
Memory.
What was that?
Muscle memory.
Muscle memory. That Dispy muscle memory.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it's a question of what this generation means, and it's a question of, is he answering one question or two? And like I said, I think it's one question, and that's why it unifies it. What was interesting was I read Sam Storm's book on the matter, and again, he's a millennial. He doesn't have that dispensational interpretation of when the millennium takes place, and he doesn't have that dispensationalist interpretation of um, of the 7-year tribulation,
Mm-hmm.
but he does split it into two questions. But what was interesting was I remember he's very good at citing opposing authors in fair ways, like either by block quotes, just letting them speak, or by accurately rephrasing it, honestly. And so he would say, like, I disagree with this guy, but here's the post-millennial quote.
Yeah.
And I remember here's the pull of preterism, the post-millennial preterism, basically. And he gave all the arguments for post-millennial preterist, that reading of the New Testament. And by the end of it, he's like, but I don't agree. And I was like, why? Because his citing and description of it was so compelling. And so, like, his book on amillennialism was like a big seed in pushing me towards postmillennialism. So it was kind of funny. And then he quoted N.T. Wright, who we would disagree on a whole bunch of stuff about. But N.T. Wright, I don't even know where he lands. I think he's either pre-mill or amill. I don't know. But he cited N.T. Wright giving sort of a postmillennial take on this passage. And I read that quote from N.T. Wright, and I was like, N.T. Wright nailed it there, and Sam Storms is wrong in his own book. It's like, but he basically in terms of unifying the two questions into one question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that was interesting. But all right. Any final thoughts on eschatology?
Who are some popular post-mill authors?
Well, Ken
Or
Gentry's a
preachers.
big one. I see it on my shelf right over there. He Shall Have Dominion. It's this thick, but I haven't read it yet. I've read little bits of it, but I guess he chases down, as it were, a lot of the passages that we tend to jump to fight this. But I'm sure he gets into like 2 Thessalonians and the Man of Lawlessness,
Yeah.
and Book of Revelation. He's actually working right now. I guess it's done. But he's done a 2-volume Revelation commentary, which is massive, but it's like delayed by like years. First by like his original publisher, I think, shutting down, and then COVID and stuff.
Yeah.
But I've been watching the updates. It should be coming pretty soon. And then if you want something really distilled down into like a quick take on just sort of paralleling like the narrative of the Old Testament with the narrative of the New Testament, and just giving a really distilled take on postmillennialism, Doug Wilson's Heaven Misplaced is good. Trying to think. Yeah, that's one that I've read all the way through. Outside of that, I've watched like lectures and stuff, but there's a lot of really good lectures from Ken Gentry on YouTube. He did like a 3-parter on Revelation that was pretty easy to digest. And then Gary DeMar has done a lot of work with American Vision. But I just watched a debate from him, and he did a talk with some Q&A. But yeah, there's lots of resources out there.
Yeah. Where does R.C. Sproul? I mean, I know he's got it all figured out now, but where did he fall?
I believe he was post-mill.
Okay.
Seeing
as he was, he was quoted here earlier, so
yeah,
or at least referenced.
Yeah.
What's wrong with you people?
Yeah. So long as he's being mentioned. Yeah, and then was there somebody else? I'm trying to think. Well, Jonathan Edwards, I guess, was a postmillennialist. It was more prevalent. It's interesting. It's sort of come in phases in church history. I think you can find postmillennialism and premillennialism kind of duking it out the furthest back in church history.
Okay.
Amillennialism, I'm not sure that. I feel like amillennialism is like a variant of postmillennialism.
Yeah.
Kind of. But it's still post-mill in some technical ways. So I'm not certain where that came up in church history. But dispensationalism has only been around for a couple hundred years. Which in and of itself bothers me. But but yeah, Jonathan Edwards was post-mill. And that was like around, the Great Renewal, the Great Awakening there. And so like, I'm sure it was influencing a lot of the way he saw like his hope for America and stuff. But
yeah, interesting thought.
But yeah, that's a whole nother part of this discussion, which we won't do now, the connection between postmillennialism and how you view theonomy. And so if you look over at Apologia Church with like Jeff Durbin and those guys, James White has recently become a postmillennialist. He's part of their church now. But they are much more open about their like political stances and how we should apply the law to civil government and things like that, because they see the world as eventually being Christianized. And so practically, how are we going to do that if the Great Commission is successful in the postmillennial sense? So I didn't even say it outright, but you'll notice if these horrendous things are passed in the preterist sense, in the postmillennial sense, that means the future then is optimistic because Christ is ruling now. And so how is that going to play out if Christ is going to win? And once you start asking that question and you start imagining Christians winning, you start to ask practically, how would we do that if like government officials are now all Christians? What does that mean for laws? And so that's why these, a lot of these churches, you look at like Greg Bonson and guys like that, they very much got into theonomy, which is this exploration of how to apply the law of God to the civil realm. And so we're not going to get into that tonight, though. That's a big topic.